So welcome everybody to this session number 2 of the Pacific Indigenous Peoples and Climate Crisis Workshop, and this session is on Pacific community resilience, protecting freshwater, food, housing, culture, and other securities. My name is Catherine Murupainga Aiken. I am the Senior Indigenous and Minorities Fellow at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Regional Office of the Pacific. And it's my privilege to present our moderator for this session, Mr. Ilisoni Leweniqila, doctoral researcher, horticulture and ethnobotany science at Massey University, Aotearoa, New Zealand. And if you'd like to introduce yourself further, Soni, I'll hand that over to you and look forward to the session. Kia ora.
Vinaka Kathy, mbula everyone, mbula sia. I'm Ilisoni Leweniqila, originally from Vunolevu, in the village of Nambuono Undu in Madoata. And mom is from the beautiful place, the northland of Tailevu, in Mburinivalu, Namena in Nananu. And it's been great. I hope that our participants have enjoyed their beautiful and big lunch there at GPH. And for this session, we'll be having 4 speakers. Without taking much time, I'll be introducing our first speaker of the evening, Dr. Fononga, Vainga, and Dr. Fononga. She's a knowledge management and communication advisor, Pacific for the Ridge to Reef program at Geoscience. That's in the Maritime and Energy Division at the Pacific Community, known as the SPC. Dr. Fononga, I hope that you can introduce yourself if I've missed some parts of who you are. Vinaka.
Thank you very much, Sir Moderator. You may have missed a few of my middle names. The name is Fononga Vainga Ofaloto Kikenani Mangisi-Mafileo. It's a very common trait for those who hail from Tonga. We have names that are so long that perhaps oftentimes we might not remember them ourselves. So please call me Inga. Nisambula Vinaka Maloilele, and good afternoon from Suva, Fiji. May I also extend a vote of thanks to the organizers of the workshop, the United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner, for your exemplary hybrid arrangements and for the invitation to participate in the panel this afternoon. Greetings from the Pacific Community, SPC. It's my pleasure to briefly share with you some experiences and lessons from the Pacific Ridge to Reef program on this afternoon's session topic through a human security and resilience lens. For those of you who might be familiar, human security and resilience explores the interplay between securities: economic security, food security, health security, environmental security, community and personal security, and political security. So these concepts focus on the security of populations, or human security, and their ability to withstand and recover from a wide array of internal and external shocks, or resilience, ranging from extreme weather to armed conflict. But just to give us a little bit of context this afternoon, let me provide some sobering facts as a backdrop for our discussion. The Pacific region is 4% landmass, 96% water. And the Pacific Ocean is the largest and deepest ocean basin on Earth. So for small island and large ocean states, like the Pacific Islands, it's critical to understand the linkages or the interconnectivity between land, forest, water, coasts, and as far out as the ocean for our sustainable development. So we're all aware that Pacific Islands are facing devastating impacts of climate change, including climate-induced extreme weather events in increased intensity and frequency, increased droughts and water scarcity, coastal flooding and erosion, changes in rainfall that affect ecosystems and food production, and adverse impacts to human health. So this is also compounded by overpopulation, pollution, and overuse of natural resources, including overfishing and intensive land and water use. And unsustainable development are also degrading our island ecosystems. Pacific Island countries are also characterized by limited human capital, and we are among the top 20 most at-risk countries, particularly Vanuatu and Tonga, which are ranked first and third, respectively, by the World Risk Index 2019. We are characterized also by narrow-based economies with high vulnerability to external shocks affecting our economic growth and the degree of economic and social volatility. I think this is also compounded by our COVID-19 over the last year. Also, our large distances from major markets. If we think also in terms of population, our population in the region is forecasted to grow from 11 million to 17.7 million people by 2050. That's an increase in population of 60% in countries, particularly Vanuatu, Kiribati, Solomon Islands, and Papua New Guinea. So this growth will present problems for sustainable development in the region, from resource depletion, land disputes, and maritime transboundary disputes as large ocean states. Given the close interconnection between land, water, coastal, and oceanic systems in SIDS, small island developing states, and large ocean states, governance and management of water and sanitation, pollution control, sustainable land use and forestry practices, balancing sustainable livelihoods and conservation, climate variability and change is ultimately and sustainably achieved through cooperation and integrated, coherent, and coordinated efforts. The strength of the Ridge to Reef or R2R ecosystem-based management approach lies in governance and management arrangements that are inclusive and participatory, with representation of stakeholders from community levels to cabinet, considerate of all knowledge, including traditional and indigenous knowledge, as well as a balance in ecological, socioeconomic, and political interests, which is also the Ridge to Reef social science to policy framework. Importantly, complex land and marine tenure systems and institutional arrangements and relationships between national and community-based governance structures make civil society organizations and community leaders in development planning essential to increase local relevance and adopt best practices of management actions and their sustainability. Strengthening cross-sectoral coordination and planning. And in previous global environment facility investments in integrated water resource management, they had seen across the 14 countries a need for functional apex bodies. These are task force comprising of government officials, CSO, local governance mechanism members, which include traditional and community leaders, and successfully linking local to national coordination. So this is key to the Ridge to Reef approach. Also key to governing and managing resources, understanding ecosystem dynamics from land to ocean, in order that we may identify and prioritize areas and resources for conservation and sustainable use. And who are the key stakeholders for governance and management as well. So this is extremely difficult, as you can imagine, compounded by a general tendency for sectoral approach. And terrestrial, freshwater, and marine specialists, for example, perhaps not working cohesively or working collaboratively, working independently from each other, which limits the opportunity for a fully integrated approach. However, in the Pacific, we're breaking new ground, so that's really wonderful news. The Pacific Ridge to Reef program is a multi-country, multi GEF agency programmatic initiative. So it guides a coordinated investment of over 90 million US dollars in GEF grant funding across different multifocal areas: biodiversity conservation, land degradation, climate change adaptation and mitigation, sustainable land management, sustainable forest management, and international waters across 14 Pacific Island countries. So this is executed by the Pacific Community, SPC, through the Regional Ridge to Reef International Waters Project. Basically what we do is support the countries in science-based planning, human capital development, policy and strategic planning, results-based management, and knowledge sharing. And just to share with you briefly about some of the innovative solutions that we've introduced in the region. The Ridge to Reef approach is an ecosystem-based approach. So it improves our knowledge base and capacity to understand the cause and effect relationship of resource interconnectivity. So it's the interconnectivity of different resources from terrestrial to the ocean, so that we're able to prioritize our local actions for effective and sustainable planning and management of resources. And to that effect, in 2019, SPC trialed what we call the Spatial Prioritization model in partnership with the government of Vanuatu. And last year, under COVID conditions, we developed a regional guide that was endorsed by the 14 countries, as well as the multi-GEF agency regional governance mechanism. And a report was published to better support the countries in the application of this model for their planning. So just to give you some numbers, a best case mixed management scenario of terrestrial and marine protected areas indicated benefits of native forest restoration of up to over 1,300 hectares, decrease in sediments by over 200 tons per year, and a restoration of marine habitats of up to 75 hectares and restoration of fish biomass of over 8 tons. So this innovation empowers national governments and their communities to understand the interconnectivity of resources and the different stakeholders that contribute or are impacted, all of the resource owners or users of the resources who should be part of an iterative process of dialogue and decision-making. Obviously, this includes Indigenous peoples. It also empowers the national governments and their communities to prioritize conservation areas at the national scale that can benefit both terrestrial and marine environments, and through the health of the ecosystems, this can strengthen human security and resilience to shocks. Also, it supports local decision-making it allows countries or communities to test policy actions and compliance and enforcement and estimate potential outcomes before they actually invest and implement. And finally, with these scarce human resources in our islands, it empowers us to look at the national governance and indicator frameworks and be able to harmonize them effectively and align regional and global conventions, which are plenty, and agreements to our sustainable development aspirations for effective cohesion, cooperation, coordination, planning, and action. And just quickly to give you a few successes from the Ridge to Reef program, one of which is a global lead, is Niue's declaration of 40% EEZ as a marine protected area. So this was huge. So that Niue Ridge to Reef project effectively created this protected area for biodiversity conservation and sustainable use of natural resources, safeguarding their ecosystem services by making Beveridge Reef an NPA. And so this is 40%, and this was a inter-project partnership where Niue, Moana Mahu covered 40% of Niue's EEZ. So this was a historic achievement for them and a significant contribution towards climate change and marine biodiversity. Some other successes across the region In terms of nature-based solutions, the planting of vetiver grass in Fiji, Samoa, Tuvalu, which is very effective in places with warmer climates, where their roots kind of go down into the ground over 4 meters. So providing effective soil bioengineering and coastal erosion protection and stabilization for stream banks. There's also been a lot of work on reforestation to improve water supply and quality, livelihood production, riverbank stabilization, flood control, and carbon sequestration in countries like Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, and Vanuatu. And finally, traditional knowledge systems. Not only do they play a key role in preserving cultural identity, but it's been reported that Indigenous communities connect to their land and cultural practices. And these are actually more cohesive, socially cohesive, improving resilience to climate change. Vusama village in the southwest coast of Fiji's mainland, they received some tourists from a nearby hotel for local customary salt crafting workshops, so making salt. The community benefits from sharing their traditional knowledge with visitors, and in turn, the profits are reinvested to promote self-sufficiency and sustainability. Traditionally, the women in the village oversee the practice. They safeguard and pass on this knowledge. The salt is used for cooking, medicine, hygiene purposes, and the revival of this practice provides younger generations of women with a sense of purpose and brings community together against social cohesion. So, but even within Indigenous communities, there are other considerations like this example, gender, and you might look further into the age segmentations as well, as an example. Drawing to a close, some of the gaps and opportunities from implementation over the last 6 years. So while there are efforts in documenting traditional practices and knowledge, how can we effectively integrate traditional and Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge systems into climate science and policy development, into innovation design, not only for sustainability, but that are actually also sustainable themselves, is a question. A second point is capacity building and technology transfer in integrated land to ocean governance and management is a gap. Institutional and policy coherence and coordination, regional coordination and governance, as well as knowledge sharing mechanisms to be sufficiently and longer term resourced and representative to optimize impact. So we're looking at finance, multi-stakeholder representation, multidisciplinary public sector engagement. And finally, also addressing transboundary and disaster risks and developing transboundary integrated management approaches. An example of this might be interconnected currents and migration of marine resources and food chain interactions, coastal and oceanic fisheries, as well as land-based to marine pollution. How can we perhaps approach the harmonization and alignment of international and domestic law and policies to adequately manage this and govern this? And to a close, 2 key lessons learned for us. Number 1 is stakeholder understanding of reach to reef, of the R2R approach, of ecosystem dynamics and resource interconnectivity to ensure that there is genuine engagement and ownership and alignment of interventions at the national level. And secondly, capacity building. Through capacity building, education, and what we call in Reach to Reef, seeing is doing, or application and advocacy to be able to identify and enable or empower champions. So this was key for us to enable and empower champions to mobilize political will at the national level from community to cabinet. So to close, we acknowledge that industrial and exploitative land to ocean practices are unsustainable. And experts, including Indigenous peoples, are now calling for a return to nature-based solutions practiced by Indigenous and local communities. And with scarce resources on hand, and to make the most of effective decisions, we must understand how resources are interconnected from the land to the ocean so that we can be strategic and prioritize our actions for improved human security and resilience, and for a sustainable future for generations to come. Malo Pika, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Inga, for that magnificent presentation. And touched for that stand that you said that on how can we integrate that the TEK, traditional ecological or traditional knowledge, into other knowledge. Our next speaker will be Mr. Gareth Quity, the project coordinator for Pacific Climate Change Collaboration, Influencing and Learning Project in the Solomon Islands.
Thank you, Sorry, for the introduction. Thank you, Sorry. So I'll be presenting on the island resilience, so a case of a Polynesian atoll of the Solomon Islands. So good afternoon, everyone. As Sonia have said, my name is Gareth, and I'm from Solomon Islands. I'm coordinating the PACCCIL project, as well as taking on an acting coordinator role for the newly established Solomon Island Climate Action Network. And I'm honored to be part of this Indigenous Peoples Climate Crisis Workshop to share some of the experiences as well as lessons learned on the island resilience, and especially a case in the Polynesian atolls of the Solomon Islands. As you have known, Solomon Islands is located somewhere in the southwest of the Pacific Ocean, and it's approximately around 200 kilometers northeast of Australia, and it has a landmass of approximately around 28,400 kilometers that extends over around nearly 1,000 islands in the Solomon Islands, and it comprises of 9 main islands. And it's a multicultural country as well. It has Melanesian, Micronesians, and Polynesian races that exist in Solomon Islands. And these very people have a very strong connection to the environment. They have traditional knowledge, very good cultural practices and beliefs that have been existed as well. And in this presentation, I'm going to delve into the island resilience of pre-Polynesian atoll islands in the Solomon Islands, namely the Tikopia Island, Renal, and the Leonio in the Ontong Java. I think the reason for my selection of these pre-Polynesian islands is that the remoteness of these islands from the main capital of Honiara. If you look at the map, I think approximately the distance from Honiara to Tikopia is around like more than 1,000 kilometers. From Honiara to Leonio is around 4,469 kilometers, and approximately around 200 plus kilometers from Honiara to Renal. So this the distance have made these islands much isolated from the main islands in the Solomon Islands. And if you travel by boat, it takes around 5 days by boat from Honiara to Tikopia, the farthest, and around 2 days to Leonio in Ontong Java, and around 1.5 days to Renal. So from this presentation, you can see that isolation is, I think, the key that I really want to present in this this afternoon. Tikopia and Renal, and as well as Luana people from Ontong Java, are great ocean people. They are great navigators, as well as they have very unique traditional knowledge, and they are very innovative. And over the years, transmigration have increased as well, and some of these people have travel from these islands to the bigger islands for employment, as well as intermarriages or for access of land and stuff like that. So migration over the years have been happening in these islands. I think with regards to the threats that currently exist in these islands with regards to climate change, extreme events, and non-climatic events is, I think sea level rise, as you all know, is one of the key threats in these islands, and especially these islands are atoll islands. So they are low-lying islands, and much of these islands are affected by the increasing sea level rise, inundation into agricultural lands. They're also affected by droughts and storms, as well as strong winds, and also other non-climatic events like deforestation due to agriculture, or home-based materials for building shelters. They've also been used up. So that has caused deforestation as well in these smaller islands. And as such, having these the islands being deforested, it would also affect climate variables such as rainfall on the islands. So these are the existing climate and extreme events. But going into the future, these existing threats will become more acute in the future. I mean, you can see for ourselves in terms of the cyclones that are affecting the Pacific Islands. It seems that the intensity before we used to have like intensity less than 3, but now you can experience those cyclones with intensity of 5. So these are very strong, intense cyclones that actually impact these very people in these islands. And as island people, these people sources of livelihood and food security are mainly fishing. Fishing is one of the main food security and livelihood of these people in the islands, which is even it's more than those people in the high islands. And in terms of agriculture, they are not so much into large-scale agriculture, but they are into like small scale. So fishing is much, the main source of these people. Even harvesting of sea cucumbers, as you can see from there. These people, especially people in Leweniqila, that is the main source of their livelihood. And as well as because of their remoteness, they also, some of the source of livelihood is through the artifacts that are sold through, contact with the tourists in the islands. Otherwise, their connection with the bigger islands is, quite isolated. So, yeah, these are the sources of livelihood that these people have experienced in these islands, and other sources includes, I think, the most common one now is the imported goods into these islands. This has become source of livelihood that, I mean, if we are not able to address, food security in these islands, that will become, overtake agriculture in the islands, or as well as fishing. So imported of goods has also become dominant in these islands because of the population that also has increased. So resources has become a scarcity in these islands. So how is food and water security being addressed in these islands? So in this, the next 3 slides, I just want to, share some of the experience and lessons and how food and water security is being addressed in these islands. Even though they are very remote or you will receive very little support, especially from the central government because of the isolation, and even with limited climate change support. But I think in terms of resilience of these islands is something that we should learn from. And especially in terms of food security, I think in these atoll islands, food security is very important, and the traditional knowledge that they have intact at the moment is something that we should learn from. And especially I'll take an example from the island in Tikopia in terms of fruit preservation. And there's a particular method that developed by these people in Tikopia where they involve with the cassava, the grated cassava. They are buried in the leaf-lined holes, and they are covered in holes for more than 3 to 6 months. And when, as a result, those grated cassava turn into something like flour, plain flour, and they are often used during long sea trips or even consumed after disasters. So, these are some of the very important traditional mechanisms that have existed in this island. And for example, in Santa Cruz, they've also, processed those breadfruit trees. So if you can see on the slide on the top, that's the breadfruit. And on the bottom, that is the fruit that was dried and packed into buckets. And, this breadfruit can be dried and used as food. And during food shortages, they eat this, the breadfruit, and it's called nambo in Solomon Islands. And as I've said, it can be stored, even a year. So these are some of the very important, mechanisms that these people have continued to survive in the islands. Also, the food bulking also happened in these islands. When they knew that there's going to be cyclone or whatever coming, then these people, going to the gardens and start gathering root crops, and they, start bulking them up. And at times, when a cyclone hit them, and then after cyclone, we always see cyclone as a negative, but on the positive side, after cyclone, there's some, it brought some positive thing, and especially in terms of soil. So like after cyclone, people come back and, start to build back by doing backyard gardening. So they're able to, survive in the short term while awaiting support from the national government. Sometimes in the islands, fishing also compensate for loss of food during natural disasters. So if the food gardens are affected, people resort to fishing. So these are some of the existing mechanisms that continue to keep these people resilient in terms of food. And also exchange of neighboring islands. And I've experienced this. I've been traveling to Tikopia and after a cyclone, and I think people from Tikopia traveling to another island called Anuta, they have to exchange for goods. So people from Tikopia taking dry coconuts up to Anuta, and then people in Anuta in exchange for pumpkins and other stuff. So this is how people in the islands actually survive. In terms of water security, I think I've learned as well that there's water preservation techniques in these islands, because we know that these people that lives in atolls, have challenges with water. So, the way that people, get water is, to preserve water through bamboo. So when there's a rain or whatever happens, they capture those water through bamboos and keep them for during a long drought period. So they also knew months that usually have low rainfall. So that is when they use those bamboos to store water. In other places I've seen is hand dug wells through the ground to get water. Also in Tikopia, I've seen people getting water from the beach, during low tide, when the sea recedes by low tide. Those women and children, they go to the beach, and then they dug up the beach, and they get water that actually underground water that flows from mainland out. So that is how they get water, to keep them alive and to meet their needs. And in some places, and during persistent drought, coconut water was also an alternative that people use in the islands. And I think with the use of coconut water, it's also a threat as well, is because the more they use coconut, they reduce coconut and for maturity, for copra making. So they also reduce the production of copra as well. But I think maybe it's an opportunity, like for example in Renol, there's a coconut variety called the Renol Island Tall. So these are large, size coconuts. So, and they have the large kernels, and the content, water content, it also has bigger water content. So something that probably in the future we might try to get those coconuts to other islands, for them to plant, so that they can also support them in terms of water. I think with the scarcity of water resources in these islands, I also tend to see that people tend to build modern day water tanks, and I can see that people started to build water tanks in the islands, and these are sourced from the projects, some of the projects, climate change projects, as well as from their own money. So people start to see the importance of these water resources. As population increases, water becomes scarcity as well. So these are some ways that we should start looking at, to support the people in this island. In terms of housing, I'm interested to share this housing security as well. I think people in Tikopia and Rainbow are well known for, they are in Solomon Islands, they are the most affected routes during cyclones. So when cyclones strike in Solomon Islands, these two islands are always affected by cyclone, and they are very prone to tropical cyclones. So these people in Tikopia and Rainbow are very unique. They have house design that they usually build for emergency. So it can be built within less than 10 minutes. So if you can see on the picture on the top, that is thatched roof house from Tikopia. So it's approximately around 1.5 to 2 meters above ground level. And through my interview of this, why the height of this house, they've said, I think the height of the house cater for strong winds, because they believe that once you raise the house high, then it also increases with the height increases with the wind strength. So they see that lower house, like 1.5, 2 meter, is how they able to survive during previous cyclones that that they faced. So I think the worst cyclone that have been experienced by us in Solomon Islands was in 2002, Cyclone Joey. If you can see on that screen on the top, there's a small one. You can see those houses. They're able to, they're able to withstand that the strongest category cyclone. So people that live in those houses are still alive. No one died, because those houses are very intact, even though there are strong winds. So And these people still keep on, living in those thatched roof houses because they believe that once there's cyclone, it's going to be safe. There's not going to be any casualty, and that's very true. When the cyclone came, there was no death because of the, even though some of the houses were destroyed, but there was no death because of they live under those thatched roof houses, which is they see as much safer than corrugated or roof iron house. So if you see on the below, that's the concept that was replicated in Renbell into a more modern design house, and I think is something that we need to, compensate people, supporting them in terms of resilience by, getting those traditional houses. How can we support them, integrating it into science? So I think why they become resilient, these people in these islands, for me, I think resilience, as we know, it's built over time, but it comes as people, or periodically or seasonally, experience an event, yeah, and they learn from past probably adaptation and mitigation measures, and as new experience occur. So this is how people they build their resilience, and perhaps why Solomon Islanders still can survive catastrophic events is because of the cultural dimensions that these islands have, as well as the traditional attributes and the social capital that exist in those communities. So that perhaps some of the mechanisms that able to keep these people in the islands more resilient. And for Polynesian people, I think community coherence is very strong. They have strong leadership, social structure in the islands that have also contributed to the adaptation and mitigations of these islands. And it's the way they have these social dimensions and interaction is way more than those people in the bigger islands, the Melanesians. So that's the difference with these Polynesian people. They have much stronger social ties among themselves. And I think because of the isolation, as I mentioned earlier, what that means for resilience building in these islands. Isolation is seen, to me, is seen as both positive and negative. Negative in the sense that these atolls are physically and generally small, so over time, these islands are going to be affected by sea level rise or other extreme events, especially with the intensity of the tropical cyclones that we experience in the Pacific. And the other one is I see that the reduction in the level of social services, given that those islands are isolated, the government services to those islands are limited. So if that is not being addressed, there's going to be a reduction as well. It will affect the resilience of these people in the islands, because once they've exploit all the resources that they've used, to help them in their resilience in the islands, then for sure they'll become they'll be affected by those social services that they never received in those islands. So I think my recommendation from this is, I think with this workshop, Indigenous people rights, I see that needs to be recognized by the government of the day. I think the free, prior, informed consent, that has to be, something that should be more important for people, especially Indigenous peoples in the Pacific. Also, Indigenous people and climate change policies, I believe, must be developed that should pave way for people's participation in the national and regional climate change issues. And resilience of Indigenous people must be documented, and I believe must be integrated with science. So, you know, like based on the experiences of lesson learned from these islands, I think it's important that we integrate that into the science as well, so that it can complement the resilience of these people in the islands. Most importantly, accessing climate finance, I think that is very important. The need for climate financing to be channeled down to communities such as these, especially those who are affected, are very vulnerable to climate change. This is important. Those climate finance need to be go down to the communities, and it must be inclusive so that people must participate in those climate change-led initiatives. Yeah, so I think to conclude, I would say while resilience of these island people are embedded and built around, you know, traditional attributes, social capital, as a result of isolation, I think the isolation should not be seen as something that we should be, you know, believe that should build their resilience, but it should be addressed, especially with the social services that has been accessed by these remote islands. I think it's very important. That is why the Solomon Island Climate Action Network, where I coordinate, is established in Solomon Islands, because we want to get the civil society organizations together to amplify the voices of the marginalized people on the issues of climate change in the Solomon Islands. So I think my message is we need to collaborate together to address the issues of climate change by being able to access climate financing to go directly to these very indigenous people in enhancing them in their resilience building. Yeah, thank you very much.
Vinaka, Gareth. Our next speaker is no other than Dr. Virginia Massey. She is an executive member of the Indigenous People Organization in Australia. Dr. Virginia, we invite you here today, and thank you so much for your availability.
Thank you, Sani. And I just wanted to say thank you so much to everybody that's organised this and through the United Nations and our wonderful elders across the islands. We couldn't do without your guidance and your wisdom. And it's so important that you walk with us to keep us on track culturally and to make sure that we're always doing the right thing with the right heart. So I think that that's really important. I think also, if I could acknowledge the wonderful presentations that we've heard, they're very informative. When you all spoke, there is a lot that we have in common. There is so much that we share. And I think that we always need to bear in mind that we can't really do this if we do it alone. Collaboration is one thing that Gareth mentioned, and I think that really rings true. Collaboration is really important, and it also means that we know that our survival on this planet means that Indigenous peoples have to collaborate together and find networks that are empathetic to support us. I think also that that's very important. The Indigenous Peoples Organisation, which I'm a board member of and an executive officer and an advisor, is a very important organisation in this way, is that it provides a voice for Indigenous matters and issues, which are a very long list of must do and must have action. So we have a variety of issues that play in with climate change, which is also Indigenous health and wealth, and also Indigenous well-being and self-determination. So it's a very long list. But when we come to climate change, and it's something that I've seen on a number of the panels that we've explored during COVID, And our communities, fortunately, and this is another issue that Gareth also raises, isolation. Isolation has really benefited a lot of rural remote communities, but there's another side of that, which means capacity and also accessing health services. So it's like a double-edged sword in a way. That isolation also leads to problems that we are well aware of. But with climate change, one of the areas that I do work in, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Australian National University in Canberra, and I'm also a practicing lawyer in my own legal firm, that I see is water security issues. Now, I left school with 4 years of high school, and that left at 16. And when I went to university, the things that amazed me is that I took my grassroots experience in the community education to really try to understand what government were doing and how we use water as communities, and how we could actually deal with the commodification of water. And that happened in Australia in 2004. So those issues of commodifying water really play out in a lot of ways. We see bottled water is used more and more across the world. Often we don't know the source of origin of those issues and where it comes from, if people are actually supportive of that water being extracted and sent off all around the world. But the other issues that really played into my research, and it's international and Australia-wide research on water security, is really climate change. And I think what we've got to do is talk about all of these issues at the same time. So our health depends on other people collaborating with us on climate change and really walking with us, because in Australia, even though many people who aren't Indigenous really have the best of health, they have good incomes and they live generally in good housing. But Indigenous Australians, and we always say we've been here forever in Australia, so we didn't come from anywhere. We've lived here and we've survived through the Ice Age. We've been very strong in culture. But the one thing that we really are really culturally present about is that our access to all of these issues with climate change goes to the heart of our identity and really who we are and our obligations that we wish to exercise under cultural law. Those are the impediments that we see with climate change, and all of the science is there, and we all know that that's very serious. But we in Australia, we don't hear very many people over the past couple of years really being incorporated as Indigenous voices in these issues. And I think that's one of the key issues that we need to address, and probably through that collaboration that we can have together as Indigenous peoples will make such a difference. Because at the moment we, as the IPO, have an opportunity to network with many other non-Indigenous groups. They try to see climate change as an ever-increasing threat. And we know that we don't want to go to 1.5 degrees. It really is frightening. So what we need to do is really what we're trying to do in IPO is collaborate with these networks to really highlight our situations, because most people really don't understand who we are and what we do. And you've very clearly explained through these presentations all the facts and the importance of our relationships with water and sea country, through the plants and animals, and who we are in the housing that we prefer, and in the lifestyle that we know that we must have to actually remain culturally effective and culturally strong with our country. So I think that through those collaborations that the IPO have been advocating on has really helped that resilience, and we're starting to see our own resilience as a community, as a board, as individuals as well, trying to advocate on a whole range of issues, and they're endless. Climate change is an existential threat, but it's also one of many. We have deaths in custody, we have children that are being removed from Indigenous families in increasing amounts. It's just frightening to think. So with climate change, the water security for us is a big issue. Since the commodification, as I said, in 2004 in Australia of water, it meant that Aboriginal people were locked out. And many of us today have talked about water security, but we just don't have that certainty in fresh water. All we have is really an acknowledgement by government that we have a right to native title, to be accounted for that in various policies. However, the other side of that is just to be incorporated in water sharing plans. And that's really not effective for us because it doesn't talk about that cultural water. Some of the work that I'm doing is in Australia is in Indigenous knowledge management and intellectual property, which I also lead in Aboriginal medicines here in Australia. And that area is really tied to climate change and the problems that we have in trying to deal with climate change, because we need our Aboriginal medicines for ourselves to deal with all of the ailments that we might come from time to time. You know, there's a whole range of issues that those Aboriginal medicines really help us from day to day, and they're our life source. However, you know, you see the popularity in bush foods in Australia is actually, again, a double-edged sword, because with that popularity means that many people take off and want those bush foods and lead those bush foods without us. And Gareth was making a really good point. The free, prior and informed consent is essential in all of these issues, especially with climate change and how we deal with it, how we adapt with it, and also how we mitigate. But we also have to have that opportunity to lead on how those medicines are used, how those bush foods are going to be used. And it also worries me personally about the integration of our knowledge with Western science. Because I actually am formally deal with these sort of issues with Aboriginal medicines, it concerns me that if our knowledge is actually integrated with Western science, how do we actually continue to have or exercise our rights over those areas of knowledge? So I think that there's more conversations that we could have with all of us in future. I think that that's really important. Free, prior and informed consent and many of the other issues that you deal with in intellectual property are not covered by domestic law. And what we need in Australia, as we can see ever more, is that we need a lot of those examples with free, prior and informed consent in agreements and contracts. Australia hasn't ratified the Nagoya Protocol, for example. So that's really not supporting us as Indigenous peoples or providing us with the capacity to exercise and lead on these areas. So I think that that's also a very serious threat to how we actually can deal with climate change, because climate change is inevitable in the way that we're going forward. And I think that, as I said previously, unless we come together and really deal with this as Indigenous peoples, and then network with others to make them understand that we actually have more to lose than many other people. So that resilience that we've always had for generations is something that we really need to draw on more than ever. And we also have to see that Western science can provide us with quite a lot of good information, but actually we know our communities better than anybody. We know when we look at the plants and the animals that, you know, something's wrong in that area, something's wrong on country. So I think that that's what we need to do is actually really make that quite clear to people that our knowledge can provide the survival of the planet. That's what we need to emphasise. Western science can work with us, and we've seen that in the bushfires in Australia. We've had very severe weather conditions. We've had some of the worst disasters over Australia. But when we read the land, we know that a lot of areas are becoming more and more populated. And many of those housing estates don't want to have fire farm practices as we always had and always did do on country. And many people just since that Royal Commission into Disasters in Australia had not really understood the benefits of cultural fire farming. So, you know, just as we use water, and many examples were given today on how you dig holes, and we have a whole range of different cultural ways in rural and remote communities that we actually access water. But many of those lakes, for example, in the south coast of Eastern Australia, are being contaminated by firefighting chemicals such as PFAS. And that's also concerning because none of the lakes can be used by the community at all. Many of the rivers have been contaminated by a whole range of contaminants from sludge, from coal mining. So there's an endless array of issues that we need to deal with. And I think that climate change has to be also seen as one of the most important issues that we're going to face in our lifetime. And I think that if we actually then look at what we can provide in resilience is our knowledge, is the very being in our identity. Because if you're a sea country person, you must be obligated to protect the sea, but it also is part of our identity and who we are. You know, the very health of us needs to really ensure that, you know, sea country and the animals that we're responsible for, the fishing that you mentioned, the community in Jervis Bay can't access that fish now. They can't eat that fish. They can't hunt the animals on community. You know, all of those issues are really, really importantly aligned with climate change. And we're not seeing any climate change policy in Australia on Indigenous issues and how it really does affect us. There's small pockets of interest and institutional interest also from Australian universities, but we need to really push together on how we lead this. And how we lead this is really as Indigenous peoples coming together, talking about these issues, how to network with other groups that are supportive of how we move forward. And that's how the IPO have really started to get traction, because we know country better than anybody else. And I think that that's really important. A number of the issues that I wanted to also bring up was food security. Food security is something that we also know that the very health of us is accessing and eating those foods that are really intrinsically aligned with who we are. And we really need to make sure that that food, as Gareth pointed out, with coconuts, with sometimes with the use of coconuts, then and the use for very positive outcomes, can also have a downside. And also with bush foods, it's exactly the same in Australia and Aboriginal medicines. The more popular that they become, the downside is that usually they'll be led away from Indigenous communities having control over it. And usually what we see in Australia is only the supply chain is what we're actually providing. It's not in the partnership of these businesses, which can actually bring a livelihood back into community. So I think those are the issues that we really need to think about. And in climate change, it's really, as you pointed out too, with marine sanctuaries, there's one issue on the chat line there. We're actually concerned in Australia because usually when a marine sanctuary is actually implemented, Indigenous people are actually put into the same category of people that are said to overexploit those fishing resources, which is really not true. So we've really got to think about when people say that we are overexploiting, it's not Indigenous peoples. It's people external to our communities, and they need to be really educated on the balance between us and the environment. That's really critical. So really having access to coming together, collaborating as Indigenous peoples, building those networks of resilience and being resilient people is something that we really need to do. I think in business, we need that opportunity to lead, but lead culturally. We don't need to look like other Western businesses, we need to create those cultural businesses that are strong, but strong from our elders. And I think that's the guidance that we really need to sustain personally. And I think that that's when we'll build healthy responses to climate change. And, you know, if it's too late in some areas for mitigation, we certainly need to see ways on how we're going to adapt and how our foods are going to adapt. If we actually allow them to really provide for us and provide for our health, we need to actually look after them, and we need to have the recognition by governments that we need to look after those areas of our livelihood, because they will sustain us. And there's no option really for our communities such as the Torres Strait Islands for them to move to Australia. You know, what we need to be pulling together is to make sure that as a world response, that we're actually ensuring that the Torres Strait Islands and many of the other islands in the Pacific will have the opportunity to live on country, because that's where we should be. And that's where other people need to understand it's not an option for us just to move away and live somewhere else. And it's the same for rural and remote communities in Australia. We're living in a global south. We're not really living a wealthy life, and you know, access to health, for example, access to education. There's a whole range of issues that really stop us from being, you know, the very best that we can. And I think that that's another issue. So, you know, the whole idea about looking after water is critical. So that's really number one for many of us, because without water, we can't survive. And the option is that we see with Western Australia, for example, they've had beautiful fresh water that's been there for generations before Western people came. And those have dried up, and now they have desalination plants. So, you know, we've really got to not only educate at the same time, but we have to build those networks so that they really understand it's not just another news item about us and about the difficulties that we face with climate change. And the science is good to support those issues and who we are and point out exactly where we're going. But I think mostly we need to say, this is happening in our communities and we're all responsible. There's not just one community that's responsible. So that's the IPO in a nutshell, is really trying to advocate strongly, to build that strong voice, and also just to ensure that we collaborate together to work together on these issues. And you're not forgotten. Everybody that's here, and also your extended families and communities in the Pacific, you're very, very important to who we are here in Australia. And it's just really important that we keep really working together and making sure that we can find these ways to culturally protect our regions, but to work together on a plan on how our voices are heard. Because I think there's so much, as you know, with our young people, you know, they're on their phones all the time, and these are all the articles that they're reading every day. It's just, you know, where does climate change fit in all of this? So we need to really make them aware to really find out how climate change is going to really be an issue you need to deal with. And we don't want to leave this generation with a mess. We need to be there, and we need to keep strong. So my love and big heart for everybody that's here today. And I really, you know, look forward to really having an opportunity to meet you in person. But from the IPO, just stay strong, and we're supporting everything that you're doing. Take care. Manangu.
Winak, Dr. Marshall, and I believe we've got less than 8 minutes left for Q&A, question and answers. If there are questions on the floor, Rob?
Yes, do we have any questions from the room?
I'm going to be very quick. Malopito, Dr. Fononga. Thank you, yeah. And thank you too much to my one talk from the Solomon Islands. I'm just going to highlight a few pointers. In a nutshell, I'm hearing governance, voice, approach, and partnership. I would like to commend the presentations that were given by the three presenters. Very good presentations, especially to my one talk from the Solomon Islands. When you were speaking, I think one of the things that we can celebrate with you is really the conversation around localization. I think for everyone in the room, we could relate to that in terms of resilience and responsiveness. Just to draw it back here, back to Fiji, I think we have our own resilience and responsive mechanisms. This is, I think, for participants in the room, this is something that we've been doing continuously for so many years now in terms of our, when we have hurricanes, we have something that we, I think in our villages, we have something called Nailololo, where we keep our food security. We have mechanisms that probably signs, I would say, before we have hurricanes, we have signs, our matuas, they would look at a sign such as probably a breadfruit tree bearing 2 fruits. That would mean we have a hurricane coming. These are some of the traditional knowledges. I would really commend my one talk for sharing that. I guess in this platform, it's not only talking about everything that's gone wrong, but actually celebrating things that we already have. I think in terms of what we already have, I believe that our laws in Fiji wants to understand and address the issues that we're all here for. Our constitution talks about our rights as an individual, our customary rights, not necessarily. How should I say? That is not being recognized, but probably to the presenters, what sort of advice can you give us in the room in terms of mainstreaming our traditional knowledge to address climate change? I'm not really sure whether you have anything around internal displacement as well. So yes, that's my question.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. And in Australia, with our communities, we have exactly the same thing. We have, during these terrible bushfires, we've had certain plants that have been flowering 6 times instead of once. So we see this in a range of issues, and also with the animals and the way they act and where they go. So we do understand what you're talking about. Now, I think as let's put my lawyer hat on right now. I guess what I'm really concerned about is when we talk about integration and also working with Western science or looking for those avenues of sharing. When we talk about sharing, we really always mean sharing from a very big heart because that's who we are. But the problem is that business doesn't think like that. It sees business opportunities and partnerships that at the end of the day will make profit. And if it makes profit for the community, I'm all supportive for it. But the problem is that when we talk about integrating, it means that what point do we know still what is cultural knowledge, customary laws, and then when does it become Western laws? It's like when you're baking bread and you've got the flour and the egg and the water and you're putting it all together. And then, you know, where's the egg? Where's the flour? Where's the water? You know, that's the problem when we integrate our own beliefs, our own customary laws. And that concerns me. So what I do is when I'm asked by a community to actually review their contracts or agreements, is to make sure that we can put those free, prior and informed consent clauses in there, that we protect intellectual property, that the elders or the community, for example, can allow things to go forward, but in a way that they can control. So there's certain clauses, provisions in there that they can work with in time. But also it would worry me too that especially in Aboriginal communities in Australia, if our customary laws was codified or put together with Western knowledge, because again, you know, where do we actually get the management of our culture? Where do we get the control and authority in our laws if they actually become pseudo-Western laws? So we've got to think very carefully on how we go about that. But the most important control mechanism that we have firstly is in the agreements we make with other parties, in the agreements that we make with other parties. I sit on the Australian National University Ethics Committee, and I can tell you that in that Ethics Committee, there are so many businesses or different parties that actually don't consider Indigenous peoples first. I think it's probably 50th on a list from 1 to 50. So we really need to be concerned that there's also moral issues that a lot of businesses contract out of. You know, they'll put a clause in there that says, well, we don't have to regard intellectual property of Indigenous people. We don't have to regard their moral rights, for example. So we need to actually talk about that within communities on what do we want to protect? How do we want to lead this particular partnership? How do we want government to allow us to lead and have that control and management? So I don't want to take up everybody else's time, but you know, there are just some of the examples that many of the areas that I'm working in, and especially as the lead project with an Aboriginal medicine in Australia, we're trying to break through those opportunities and barriers to actually teach the Therapeutic Goods Administration how Aboriginal people really want to go forward. It's not there at all yet. So, you know, that's going to make a huge difference. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. Well, are there more? Gareth?
There was a question for the floor. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Sorry, can you hear me? Okay. It's going to hide behind something. Thank you very much for that. And thank you also to the speakers for sharing your presentations as well today. I just wanted to just if you could just elaborate more on that answer. So I think my colleague, from what I understood, was we were thinking mainstreaming Indigenous knowledge for other rural communities, not necessarily resilience methods for urban areas, but mainly for the rural Indigenous communities. Yeah, because that's the context for Fiji.
Well, I think that's really important for community grassroots education. And that's something that we really try to do here, is trying to not only have our own community really understand cultural values, but when we're mainstreaming it, it means that just to know how we again manage and control those areas. I think what we need to do is, if we're just going to do it orally, that's fine. But once we put it into writing or in our own languages, then I think it's just really, again, having that ability to manage and also to have authority over those processes. Because within communities, for example, in Australia, you might have one language group, but it might be then divided into 14 or 20 or more different dialects or, again, language groups. So what other anthropologists call clans. So, you know, it can be many people, many nations within that one language group. So for everybody really to have the opportunity to co-lead on that, what you call mainstreaming community education, is really important. If those processes are thought out very well on how that intercepts other communities within your own community, then and have those agreements and have that ability then to have that shared out so people get all of the messages and have that ability then to share and respond. That's a very sensible way to go forward. But I think everybody is going to really have to understand what processes need to be put in place to really share that knowledge on a grassroots level. So I think that's something that you can actually do. I think if we had more time, I could sit down with you and explain that better. But I think that that would be the way, is having those processes. So there's not miscommunication, because even in our own communities, a lot of people could say, oh, I thought you were going to do that, but then it didn't happen. And sometimes it's very clear that we need to protect biodiversity, and fire management is really important to us. So to have very effective programs, what we do in Australia is have Aboriginal rangers, but they still have to communicate back with their elders. They can't do that alone, no matter what age they are. So I think that that's really important as well. Thank you for that opportunity.
We had another question from the floor just here, yeah.
Hello, thank you very much for that answer. Yes, if you do have time, we can have that discussion.
We'd love to have that discussion.
Yes, yes, if we can have this for another week. Check. Okay. Yeah, so sorry, I just, so my colleague in front of me, she had also touched as well on the presentations, and you all shared a bit on it as well. I just wanted to add on to, my name's Eleni, I'm from FemLink Pacific. We work in 9 districts for the empowerment of rural women in Bua, the Kaunrove, Maduata, Nandi Lotoka, Rakrekta Buamba, and Central area as well. In terms of discussions too that came up in our women's networks, we have about 500 women that for the last 10 years, we have been having monthly consultations. And for them, it's also a space where they're able to communicate what their priority issues are, their developmental priorities, as well as their recommendations and solutions going forward, and how for them being empowered to take back that information to their women's groups to be able to also empower the women in their communities. So yeah, just talking, just also the presentation on Solomon Islands in terms of food security, and just adding on that, so in terms of the Indigenous knowledge, to practice their resilience in terms of disaster management in Fiji. And as we all know, resilience for Indigenous people living in urban areas are very different to those in rural communities and the maritime areas. So the needs are also different for women, for children, the elderly, persons living with physical disability, as well as mental illness, as well as for youth and the LGBTQI. So something that we noticed also was during COVID-19 last year, there was a huge urban to rural drift. And this also put a strain as well on, from what the women had communicated, a strain on their finances. There was an increase in financial dependency as well for the rural communities, the rural women, especially because in villages, women are the backbone. You know, women in every household, the women do the cooking, the cleaning, they look after their families. They are the first one to wake up, to prepare everyone, and the last one to go to sleep at the end of every day. So, you know, something that came through was, and as we all know, cross-cutting through all security pillars is human security, yeah? And so for them, like, you know, there was an increase not only in financial dependency, but also in violence against women and girls in the community, especially youth, persons living with disability, the elderly. Since COVID, there has been an increase in violence in urban areas, but a lot in the rural communities that haven't been reported. And, you know, for us, that's a priority when we look at human security altogether. Sorry, so coming back to my question, I just got, I don't know if you can see my notebook, but it's everywhere. Okay, right, so my question was, so in this space, I really thank UN, especially for providing this space for everyone. I wish there was more people in the room, but I know I've seen the program for tomorrow that they'll be here as well to talk on that. But I just wanted to ask, how would we then work in collaboration and ensure resolutions from this space or spaces like this is localized down to the context of our rural indigenous communities? Because as we know, for different countries, our needs are all different. So I know in New Zealand, there's a struggle with indigenous consent, as was mentioned earlier. For Fiji, our context is different. There is consent, but sometimes the issue is that the middleman between the big companies and our village heads or our chiefs or landowners, the middleman is the one that's creating the issue and not communicating properly the fine details in those contracts, you know, when they give away the land. So I guess, yeah, what I want to ask is then how will we be able to, sorry, let me just read my question. So how would we work in collaboration to ensure resolutions from spaces like this is localized down to the context of our rural indigenous communities in our different countries? Pinaka.
You've raised some amazing issues and things that we also share in Australia, Indigenous Australia. And, you know, our rate of domestic violence, and I lived in domestic violence with my Aboriginal partner for 17 years. And, you know, the effect it has is just ongoing. And yes, women are the backbone. There won't be any Indigenous woman that disagrees with you. You're absolutely right. I think that, you know, that's, again, the situation that you explained is something that's happening here in urban and rural and also remote settings where the middleman or some other person has decided to railroad a situation that could have been an outcome that supports community instead of works against community. And that's a human element, unfortunately, and it's something that we don't just only have in our community, it's across non-Indigenous communities as well. But I think it hurts more when it's within our communities because we know how hard it is to struggle and also, you know, survive through all of those various issues that you actually highlighted. So I think that really it's making sure that we really know what the middleman's going to do before they do it. I think that's really having an ear to the ground and having opportunities to really talk these things out before it gets to them. And we've seen that, as I said, many times here, the whole range of issues. It's happened in housing, for example, in areas of Sydney, where housing was supposed to be set aside for Aboriginal people ongoing, and that was railroaded by a range of people, non-Indigenous and Indigenous. So it really hurts when that happens. But all I can say is keep an ear to the ground to know before these things turn into very bad situations, and the ability to talk and take action. And there are a lot of people who are out there in a whole range of rural, remote and urban communities here in Australia that want to take advantage, but there's a lot of good people too. And we really need to harness those sort of people that can actually assist us and assist us with our capacity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We just have one final question. I know the moderator is trying to keep to the time limit, but we have one final question. It's a very important question for them.
Thank you, Mr. Leweniqila, for giving me this time. This is specifically for the Reach to Reef project, Dr. Vainga. Now, this session, the title says the Pacific Community Resilience, Protecting Freshwater, Food, Housing, Culture, and Other Securities. I would like to just introduce it on 4 words that drills it down to Indigenous people. Enhancing Pacific community resilience to enhance identity, unity, prosperity to eternity. That's us in the Pacific. I'll say it again. Enhancing Pacific community resilience to enhance our identity, our unity, our prosperity towards eternity. That's us. The Pacific is a Christian region. I don't have to mouth that because I do this in Asia Pacific Forum and global forums. So I'm so thankful that I have that opportunity again here. Now, there is an issue. Let me have some very, very quick reflection on all the speakers. One, there is a direct need for integrating planning when we talk about Pacific resilience at crop agency level. Sorry, I'm a sub-shooter. I'm shooting some subspecies. Crop agencies, meaning all those crops agencies. Don't you feel, as a knowledge management coordinator, and I'm also talking to you, my one talk brother, PACCCIL, because I'm involved also in that regional project. Don't you feel there is a critical importance in integrating planning at conceptual level in projects at that level where we hit the nexus, where we talk about all those issues? Let me mouth it: food, water, energy, and also a dominant component to be indigenous people. I have been involved in programmatic approach in projects for the Pacific and in Fiji, especially Jeff and GCF for the past few years. This is something that is a critical gap. Doctor, you mentioned some of those gaps, and I'm sympathized that you still, we still continue to discuss it. Now that is something, I put it as a question. Don't you feel that there is this great need for that collaboration between SPREP, SPC, FFA, PIFs at that level? The next one, which was silent in one of the, talks about value adding. And I heard it a little bit on gender, women empowerment. Now there is still this, we need to appreciate the fact that when we want to jump into alternative livelihood projects, either agro-based, our women from Vainga here, they want to go into some of those processing. The projects or the components and activities go silent when we want to fully understand the supply chain and logistic issues out there. When we talk about pricing, all that. This is something that we really, really need to come in when we talk about that. When we talk, we always hover over enhancing resilience by talking about women in the village doing projects. But so because of the supply chains. And another second question, when we talk about Madam, the last speaker, when we mentioned striking ecological balance between development, growth, and sustainability, don't you feel that we have this need of institutional engineering? I want to introduce that principle, the concept of institutional engineering, where we understand each other. All ministries and sectors needs to be on the same page, because this is something in Fiji where we talk about the youths. Ministry are talking about something on development of the youths, where another ministry are talking about another program called Rural Millionaires. Now, when we try to assess this and try to superimpose it on enhancing climate change, these are two policy, classing policies. With the youths, I am empowered on one hand to do business, where the other side, we are being encouraged to rake all our forests to plant Angona and become rural millionaires. I'm just trying to be practical, please. That is something. So institutional engineering, don't you think there is a great need here? And the second last one is, please, we in the Pacific, when we talk about indigenous, don't you feel that there is a great appreciation of the spirituality dimension of climate change? Now, when we talk about spirituality, I've heard it from this morning. I want to further split it. Spirituality / religion / culture. Now you're really talking about indigenous now. So those are the issue. Don't you think there is a need where we have this nexing, the nexus where we want to bring in? I'm just wondering whether a member of a faith-based organization is sitting here in the room. These are the dominant players that needs to be brought out. Brought out meaning faith-based, because this is something to our heart. And we tend to keep it to us. When you talk to a talatala or talk to a rabbi or talking to, this is something that we keep. But then don't you feel when we conceptualize and document and formulate these projects, what are some of those, like the two ladies before me, we want to mainstream, to localize and adapt, so that we need to bring them out so that they can share? Because something that I would like to share, they have the widest and time-tested network of religious organizations out there. Last but not the least, something that I want to keep, this is my heart, the principle of intergenerational equity. This is about our kids. This is about our children. A good implementer of a project or a good father and mother try to duplicate himself or herself before he fades out. So there is a need, don't you think, the panel, to elevate the critical importance of timely dissemination of climate change to our children? You know, I'm thankful that some of the sponsors are talking about child protection policy and all those things. But I just feel that we need to put it again on the table to see, maybe we'll see come tomorrow, where I will be in the West joining you virtually, that we can see this finding its way on the resolution. Thank you so much, Mr. Leweniqila, for this time.
Well, thank you so much for that question. And I was thinking of that, the question will be directed to one of the panelists. But yes, I believe there need to be a collaboration. When we talk about indigenous knowledge, for example, when we talk about indigenous people, for example, for us Itoke people, we are connected to our ecosystem. So once a cycle has been destroyed, I believe, you know, our eating habit will be affected, or our lifestyle living will be affected. So I believe there need to be a collaboration between the government, the NGOs, and other organizations. COVID-19 has revealed that when the rural economy collapsed, I believe, the urban economy collapsed, the rural economy was driving us here in Fiji. So I believe when we talk about indigenous people, they have a mouth and they need to be recognized. The word there would be, there need to be a solidarity approach in development, especially to us in the Pacific people, where people, when we talk about people, their knowledge, heritage, and all that are connected in that should be recognized, should be the first priority. So with that, I believe that I'll round off with those idea and knowledge that I believe that would help us for today. And enjoy your evening and have a blessed day.